BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. So yesterday on the channel, we were talking about the death of Steve McNair, the former NFL player with the Tennessee Titans who was murdered. And I mentioned another case about a doctor who was involved with another murder accusation of his own. And I just drew an absolute blank on the guy's name, and I think the name that I came up with was Chris Koulis, and I was mistaken. This is actually going to be the case of Dr. Chris Koulis that we're going to be talking about today. Chris Koulis, I must have been thinking of Chris Koulis, who was the writer of the book Into the Wild. He changed his name to Alexander Supertramp, and then they turned his book into a movie that featured Emil Hirsch. Into the Wild, yeah. It was a fairly famous film about 10 years ago or something like that. But then I just really started thinking more about the case of Dr. Chris Koulis and the woman that he was accused of murdering, Lesa Buchanan. This was one, though, that, once again, I know this is not a very popular case that a lot of people are just dying to hear about, but at the same time, though, the reason why we have a channel like this is because, well, we want to talk about many different true crime cases, and I was mentioning it yesterday and realizing that I was quite fuzzy on a lot of the details, so I also want to learn about these things just for me so I can have a greater understanding of what's going on in the true crime world and always try to be as up-to-date and as accurate as possible. And it's been a long time since I saw this stuff from the first time. It must have been about 10 years ago or something that I was watching this story on TV, because we're actually going to have to go back all the way to 2005 when this took place. They did an episode of Dateline 48 Hours about this, about the case of Dr. Chris Koulis, but I heard about this one. I swear I was watching TLC. I swear it was on TLC that I saw a different kind of documentary-style program about this case. But without further ado, let's discuss a little about the case of Dr. Chris Koulis and the death of Lesa Buchanan. And the first thing to note is, his name is spelled Christ, but it's not pronounced Christ. During the whole program, I thought his name was just Chris, like Christopher, but once you see it written out, it's actually pronounced Christ. Just that note. And Lesa Buchanan also spells her name Lesa, so we have Chris and Lesa, but just a little bit of the alternative spellings going on. But yes, and we also have an article here from NBC News, which is one that I don't actually talk about too frequently. I've mentioned that I don't like CNN's coverage of true crime cases, but I found a very detailed article here by Keith Morrison that was published on April 25th, 2008. The very, very detailed. It's a very lengthy article. It took ages to read this whole thing, but hopefully we'll have some good things to say about this one here. Okay, though, so what really happened, though, with Dr. Chris Koulis and Lesa Buchanan? As I mentioned, though, Lesa Buchanan ended up dead. Is this a case of a whodunit, or is this the case of an accidental death? What on earth is really going on here? Well, what we really have to say is that Dr. Chris Koulis was an individual who was working as a plastic surgeon, and an individual came in once for a consultation. Her name was Lesa Buchanan. She was someone who had some trouble with addiction, but she was also a very creative individual, and Dateline actually has some of her performance material. Like, she was a puppeteer and trying to do some creative arts performances. She also wanted to start a career as a children's book author. A very creative and outgoing performer. She put a lot of energy into the performances. But she did end up getting involved with this individual named Dr. Chris Koulis, and they began somewhat of a romance, somewhat of a kind of affair, if you will, kind of like a scandalous affair, because the kind of details of their relationship are still very foggy. If you read some sources, they will be talking about that they ended up being boyfriend and girlfriend, and other things say they were just casual lovers, and there's even one source that I read that said at the time of her death, Lesa Buchanan and Chris Koulis decided to become engaged. But what happened was, I think the thing that Keith Morrison wrote is a very good way to introduce it. Love can be so unpredictable, gentle, caring, or it can also be a passionate fire, out of control, scorching what touches, and consuming the lives of lovers pulled back for more. Such was the romance and its fate at the heart of our story. It's a story told in part through raw and shocking videotape, which captures the most private of moments, two lovers on a long weekend that would end in death. Long story short, Chris and Lesa develop somewhat of a long-distance romance. They have interactions together, but Lesa has this very big addiction to pain medicine. We're talking about things like oxycodone and such. Okay, so she has having some problems with drug addiction. We already mentioned that a little bit. And then she goes for a weekend with Chris Koulis, and they film a 2-hour sex tape that is very, very, well, not only raunchy, but of course, as a sex tape, right? But it's also bizarre because Lesa is very clearly drugged up. She is very clearly under the influence of a certain substance, even to the point where she has a gauze pad on her thigh. And you can actually hear at one point in the video, Keith Morrison has given me these details. I wasn't able to recall them from watching the documentaries, but that Chris actually tells her, put pressure on it. And this is something that we would really see would lead, eventually, what's going to happen? Lesa ends up dead. What was the cause of her death, though? Was she injected with drugs by Dr. Chris Koulis? Was he the doctor, the person who injected her? Or was this something that she had done to herself? And the big question, though, and the reason why so many media outlets were talking about this about 10, 15 years ago 14 years ago specifically, is because what should happen to the doctor? What was his role in this? Was he guilty of murder? Was he guilty of manslaughter? Was this just an accident that happened unbeknownst to him and he didn't really know the gravity of the situation? Or is he completely innocent? What's going on? And that's one of the things, though, why they really just had to make sense of this. And the law can be quite tricky. But, it's like, we also should look at one thing here. Several months, after the long-distance romance rekindled, Koulis maintains that he never knew of Lesa's drug use, but there were signs on a visit a month before her death. And this was a conversation that Lesa's family say never happened. So at first, Chris starts out by saying that he's denying Lesa's drug use. He doesn't know about it. He doesn't want to talk about it. But the thing is, though, even in the video, there is evidence that there were syringes present in the place where Chris and Lesa were filming the sex tape. Then what happens is when the police are kind of inspecting Chris's apartment, they find countless syringes. And they're just like, well, he is a doctor, and a doctor has, all sorts of medical things in his apartment aside from syringes. So once again, though, it's like you got to see what really do we make of this evidence. But the thing is, though, even the ordinary layperson can see the video of Lesa Buchanan and see that she is somewhat disoriented. She's definitely under the influence of some substance. And during the trial, they would post very particular stills that show Chris Koulis looking directly at the gauze pad, looking directly at the area where Lesa had been injected. And, as we said, he already made a comment about it. He knew that there was something that was wrong. But at the same time, is he just a lover that was only focused on his own self-interests? Or was he somebody who actually injected her and didn't say anything because he didn't want to go to the authorities? He didn't want to get in trouble. He didn't want to lose his medical license. He didn't want to be in legal trouble. Talk about going to jail for a long time. And we also need to bear in mind that Chris Koulis was a doctor that was not free from scandal in the past. He was currently on probation at the time of this incident. So he had all sorts of reasons to hide this. But at the same time, as a doctor, shouldn't he have known that she was very drugged up during the filming of this? And this is kind of one thing, though, that I believe that the TLC special that I saw introduced it as. Chris was talking about how he saw Lesa unconscious, and he walked over and he slapped her. And he's like, I know I shouldn't have done it, but that was the first thing I did. I slapped her. And I was watching this program with my sister at the time, who wasn't a doctor yet, but she was in medical school. And she's like, absolutely not. A doctor has specific training to check for the vitals first. That's what every doctor should know, like second nature. And I was like, well, what about people being different? What about in the heat of the moment he found his lover unconscious? What if he had a lapse in judgment? And she was trying to insist to me that that's not really the way that things would have gone down. That's not the way that things would have happened. Once again, it should be a second nature for a doctor to check for the vitals first, not to slap his lover in the face. So then I asked, well, then why is he saying that he slapped her in the face? And my sister's explanation was there was probably something like there was a bruise on her face or there was some sort of discoloration, so he wanted to create an explanation for that. I mean, she just flat out did not believe the story, but, she's a doctor, I'm not, so that's just something to throw in there about the case of Chris Koulis. Okay, so then Lesa, of course, is pronounced dead, and they believe that this is a result of the drug use that she was involved with during the sex tape with Chris Koulis. But the thing that the defense team wanted to really try and reiterate was there was no videography of Dr. Chris Koulis injecting Lesa Buchanan with any of the drugs. There was no video evidence of him using the syringe on her. He could see very clearly that she had a place with the gauze pad that had been, the point of entry for the syringe. He knew exactly what was going on. And as a doctor, he would have been able to recognize that she was in a very messed up medical state. But there was no evidence of him injecting her himself. Did he actually do it? That is one of the things that just, the jury and the prosecution and the defense teams were not able to determine who injected her with the drugs. But by the way, though, when Chris Koulis was on the stand, the reason that he gave for having all of these syringes with him during this weekend was erectile dysfunction. He said that he brought those there because they had plans of having marathon sex for the weekend. I mean, can't really fault anybody for wanting that. And that the syringes were there for erectile dysfunction so he could perform during the duration of the weekend that he was going to be spending with Lesa Buchanan. But what do we really make of this situation? I think we need to kind of get to some of the concluding things that were associated with the... what should be the legal outcome of this? There's no evidence that he injected her. But at the same time, as a doctor, he should have known that she was in a messed up state. Would he be guilty of murder? And, they were asking this when I was watching this, documentary program. And I was like, no. I was just saying it right out loud. I'm the kind of person who talks to the television. Jay Leno described it as, it's like, look out, Kojak. Thanks, viewer. I'm one of those people. So it's like, I was talking to television. I said, no, he shouldn't be guilty of murder. Should he be guilty of manslaughter? I also said, no. Should he be guilty of criminally negligent homicide? And I said, yes. And that's exactly what happened. Chris Koulis was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and sentenced to how many years in prison? 2. 2 years for being negligent in the homicide of Lesa Buchanan for the sole reasons that we've laid out many times. A doctor was in a place where he should have known that this individual needed medical attention. He should have known that she was not in any sort of health state where she should have been continuing. She needed to go to a hospital. But the thing is, though, they were just trying to sort of make this sort of seem like nothing was wrong. Chris Koulis was ignoring that for his own selfishness, and if he had done something differently, maybe she wouldn't have died on that exact day. So, criminally negligent homicide. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but he was allowed to spend time outside of prison during the appeal. So, what happened? It was actually kind of a twist in the story. Chris Koulis ended up dying from a heart attack at age 42, and without even really serving for this, and that was just a shocking thing. I remember seeing that on the television. I was like, whoa. Talk about just a weird series of events. This kind of negligent doctor, the steamy sex tape, someone's dying from it, unanswered questions. And this was what first introduced me to the concept of criminally negligent homicide. And then Chris Koulis passes away. I mean, life has some complicated and dark twists in the story. But what I would say about things like this is that it's just, the law is very tricky. For example, he was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, and I was having a conversation once with somebody who said that every time somebody is responsible for someone's death, it is at least manslaughter. And we were having this conversation about the self-defense laws, really, and I won't make any comment about self-defense law in America, not even about stand your ground laws in the state of Florida or something like that. But That is just simply not the case. Anytime someone's responsible for someone's death, it is at least manslaughter. The law has so many different ways that they can view the concept of causing someone else's death. This is a perfect example of that, criminally negligent homicide. And if you look at a case from South Africa like Oscar Pistorius and the murder of Rita Steenkamp, he was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide. But of course, South Africa and the United States of America, where we are, that has a bit of a different legal system. But what about, if somebody is drunk, like doing a DUI, and they run over somebody in the street? Are they guilty of manslaughter? Possibly. They can be guilty of vehicular manslaughter, vehicular homicide, but also the lawyers can reduce it to a lesser charge of DUI with death. There's so many ways that someone can cause somebody else's death and not be guilty of manslaughter or murder. I mean, that's just simply not the case. And this is one of the incidents where this really kind of also modeled my thinking on this. I was a college student at the time when we were first watching this documentary about Chris Koulis and Lesa Buchanan. And this was one of the things that always stood out to me about how the law can frame things differently, and different people are subject to different sets of laws. In this case, a doctor was being criminally negligent, and that allowed for the death of Lesa Buchanan. So the law is very tricky. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm glad I'm not a lawyer, because when I see lawyers on television, what about the people that are just prosecuting innocent people, get up there shouting with all that passion and energy about how disgusting this person is, and they don't even care if it's true or false. It's only about winning. That's only one very, very small aspect of the law. Other lawyers do very good things, and they're all about victims' rights, and they're all about protecting people, and they're all on the side of fighting for clients who didn't commit these crimes, and they're trying to do good things. And some of the prosecutors prosecute bad people. But the things that I don't like about the law is that it's not about the truth. Sometimes it just seems only about winning. But we started this talking about, though, the different types of charges as opposed to the behavior of the lawyers. Lawyers do what they have to do. I mean, I have lawyers in my family. Maybe you have lawyers in your family. It's a messy process. That's all we can say about it. But I think almost all parties are in somewhat of an agreement that lawyers are not always on the side of the truth. They are on the side of victory. But when it comes to the law, there are many different ways with that they can use that to get different types of charges, like criminally negligent homicide, culpable homicide, DUI with death for those instances. Now, when we want to look at the case of Chris Koulis and Lesa Buchanan more specifically, we can also see that Chris did not get off on everything as well. He was convicted of unlawfully supplying Lesa with drugs. Actually, this was prior to the thing. This was actually the incident that caused his probation. This was in 2002, and he actually was on probation because of the person that he had supplied drugs to unlawfully was none other than Lesa Buchanan. And then it was that incident that actually tipped off the police, and that's what prompted them to investigate his house and to search his home and to find all the other syringes that had been located in his home. So as you see, though, this is something that is very, very messy, and everything would have come back to Chris Koulis eventually, and I was just looking at a few more things from Keith Morrison's article. But what we can really see from this one is that the law functions in different ways for different people, and one of the only sad things about this is, the saddest thing is Lesa Buchanan lost her life, and it's also sad that the person who was responsible for ending her life didn't end up in jail. But we see this time and time again. And yes, of course, there's a little bit of speculation. Did Chris Koulis actually maybe commit suicide or something, do something that caused his heart attack? I'm not necessarily sure. It's almost convenient that he died in the way he did, but that's all I really have to say for now. If you have any comments to say at all about the death of Lesa Buchanan and Chris Koulis, I would like to hear some comments below, and I would love to hear from you, and until next time.